After getting murdered by a random guy, corporate slave Mikami Satoru gets reborn as a freakishly powerful slime in an alternate world where he decides to become a messiah, build a harem, create a fantasy world Jurassic Park ripoff. Rimuru, who sat alone while a cute servant girl poured him some wine, mused over his defeat of the weakling Clayman and his subsequent admission into the cult-sounding Octagram, a group of 8-star demon lords. Before this, the demon lords, Leon, a wannabe Sasuke Uchiha, and Valentine left the group's conference immediately. Guy then hosted a dinner party for those who stayed back. During the dinner, Rimuru, who wasn't used to the lifestyle of an elite, gushed over how tasty the food was and told Raphael, his magical AI assistant, to steal the recipe. However, he quickly noticed how Milim ate like a wild tiger and realized that manners didn't actually matter to the other demon lords, probably because table manners weren't a priority for demons. The demon lords soon began discussing the mystery mastermind behind Clayman, with Milim stating that she enjoyed pretending to be controlled by Clayman since it allowed her to battle against Rimuru. As they discussed, the servants began sharing alcohol, resulting in Milim throwing a tantrum because Rimuru wouldn't allow her to drink the brandy like the other demon lords, although she was the oldest. While Milim acted like an overgrown baby, the other demon lords commented on the quality of the brandy, with one saying that Valentine would have loved it. His statement about Valentine got Rimuru thinking about all the things he wanted to ask the elusive demon lord. Still, he figured that those questions could wait until the next time their paths crossed. At that point, Raphael chimed in to inform Rimuru that he had finished analyzing the meal, and they could now recreate the full dinner course. Meanwhile, Ramirez had collapsed from too much alcohol consumption, while Beretta panicked over her well-being. At that point, Rimuru and his entourage took their leave from the party and returned home. Back in the growing town of Tempest, the townsfolk were going about performing mundane chores and living their everyday lives. When they noticed that their lord and savior, Rimuru, had returned, they all immediately dropped to their knees before Rimuru, who seemed confused as to why they did it, but secretly liked the ego boost. As he stood there in shock, Rigurd came running towards Rimuru and the others like his pants were on fire and welcomed Rimuru back to Tempest. Likewise, Diablo also appeared before Rimuru and congratulated him on his admission into the Octagram. Like an adoring lover, he then stated how glad he was that Rimuru returned home safely, while Rigurd urged Rimuru to take his time recovering his energy after going through such a stressful experience. Later in the day, while Rimuru lounged with his crew in the palace, a servant named Haruna brought him a plate of matcha pudding. She remarked that although her cooking skills stink when compared to Princess Shuna, they're still better than most. Lord Veldora also asked for some matcha pudding, which the servant girl presented to him. Diablo also gave Lord Veldora an additional portion of the matcha pudding. This caused Lord Veldora to laugh and commend Diablo for his strong sense of duty. The exchange between the sexy demon and the demon lord caused Rimuru to ask if Diablo wasn't going to eat some himself, to which he replied that he was making payment to Lord Veldora for information and that Rimuru shouldn't worry about him. However, his statement about receiving information caused Rimuru to realize that it was Lord Veldora who had informed Diablo about what happened at Walpurgis. Rimuru then asked Lord Veldora how many desserts he sold the information for, to which Veldora sheepishly replied, 5. Disappointedly, Rimuru pointed out that Veldora didn't even need to eat. Still, Lord Veldora replied that it wasn't a matter of whether he needed to eat or not, but rather, he eats because he wants to eat. Lord Veldora also pointed out that Rimuru himself didn't need to eat either, which left Rimuru speechless. Having won the argument, Veldora went back to eating his pudding. Meanwhile, while the two demon lords were arguing, Shion, who sat beside Rimuru, finished up her pudding. Diablo then asked if she had properly assisted Rimuru during the Octagon meeting in a whack attempt to flirt. She replied that not only did she do her job properly, but she also proved that Rimuru didn't need Diablo while she was around. Shion also asked if Diablo had completed the task Rimuru assigned to him in the hopes of proving his inadequacies. However, Diablo laughed and said he'd completed the task to perfection. At this point, Rimuru interjected by asking how Diablo timed his return so perfectly as to align with theirs. Diablo told him that he had been attending to other matters when Lord Veldora contacted him and advised him to return. At the mention of his second act of snitching, Veldora attempted to flee but was stopped by Rimuru. He tried explaining things to Rimuru, but that didn't work. Rimuru screamed that he shouldn't interfere with other people's work and collected his pudding. After this, Rimuru asked Diablo if everything was all right with Falmuth, to which he replied that things were proceeding as planned with his informant on the job. He further added that he restored everyone to their original forms, as it was inconvenient to leave them as lumps of flesh. Before this, Diablo's healing magic couldn't effectively revive the bodies contained within the boxes in his carriage. Thus, he decided to use some extreme measures. Meanwhile, those in the carriage driving opposite Diablo wondered if the 3 people Diablo were trying to revive would make it to Falmouth in one piece. Back in Diablo's carriage, he had successfully revived one of the bodies and was deliberating who to revive next. Then, a voice from one of the people in the boxes started pleading with him to revive the king first. His pleadings caused Diablo to inform him that there would be a high price for fulfilling the favor. This made the voice Razan remember that he was dealing with Noir, one of the 7 primordial demons. He then shivered at the thought that Noir served Rimuru, a demon lord with unimaginable powers. Razan also acknowledged to himself that by engaging the city of Tempest, they had awakened a sleeping lion. Once done, remembering what occurred in their battle with Tempest and how Shion whooped their asses, Razan asked to be the lowest of Diablo's slaves and pledged his undying loyalty to him. He also pleaded that Diablo show King Edmaris mercy. Diablo accepted his pleas on the condition that they no longer disrespected his great lord Rimuru. He further informed Razan that if he sensed a hint of malice, he'd kill the king as well as every living thing in Falmouth. Understandably, Razan reaffirmed his loyalty, but upon hearing this threat, the fat archpriest whom Diablo had earlier revived also went on his knees and pledged his loyalty to Diablo and his lord Rimuru. Meanwhile, the king overheard the entire exchange from within his box and remembered how badly Shion had beaten his ass. He then concluded that Razan had made the right decision in pledging his loyalty to Diablo. He also swore to cooperate in any way Diablo desired, which pleased the demon. Diablo assured them all that so long as they obeyed him, he'd treat them well, like his pet dogs. At that point, Yum, who was in the carriage riding beside Diablo's, called over through his window and asked if the prisoners were still alive. To this, Diablo replied in the affirmative and informed him that they would soon reach the kingdom of Falmouth and that they should quickly finish their task of taking it over. The next day, in the kingdom of Falmouth, the king's courtiers were confused about how to revive his body from the box it was trapped in. None of the magic they used was able to return him to his original form. They asked Razan to explain how the king's body got trapped, as well as what happened to the king's army. Razan replied that he cooperated with the champion to ensure the king's escape. The news that the monsters won the battle left them all in shock. He further explained that their battle with the monsters woke a dragon that had been sleeping in their land. Although the Western Church said the dragon was destroyed, its death wasn't permanent, as it was simply reborn elsewhere in the world. They just hadn't expected it to be reborn so soon or in a place close to them. Razan also informed them that upon Veldora's return, all the knights and monsters in that area disappeared, leaving him, the king, and a few others. At that point, Diablo and his entourage from Tempest walked in like they owned the place. The Lord's presence immediately started demanding that the strangers leave. Still, the fat priest, who had sworn his allegiance to Diablo, interjected. He claimed that the strangers had saved them from death on the battlefield, stating that the monsters understood the land better than them, and upon Veldora's resurrection, everyone present on the battlefield was resolved to die at the hands of the storm dragon. Then Razan added that when things looked dire, someone stood between them and the dragon, and that person turned out to be the monster's leader, Great Rimuru. They informed the lords that although they were both ready to die, Great Rimuru convinced Veldora to let them live. While Razan and the priest spoke to the lords, Diablo stood behind them, smiling as they did his bidding. The lords, on their part, were shocked that Rimuru could communicate with Veldora, because just being in contact with the dragon's dense magic meant instant death for most living things. The priest then informed them that Rimuru was also the leader of the Great Forest of Jura. Although they assumed he had been lying, Razan assured them that he had seen the city himself and stated that it was truly worthy of being called the capital of a nation. He added that even the Dryads, who were the guardians of the Great Forest of Jura, served Rimuru. This information further stunned the lords, who knew that the Dryads were powerful monsters who protected the land where Veldora slept. Thus, they decided that if Rimuru could negotiate with the dragon, Veldora, then they couldn't afford to have him as an enemy. At that point, Room interjected that they shouldn't worry about Rimuru destroying them, as he's usually nice. This statement got all the lords to relax. Then Lord Carlos stated that Room could serve as a mediator and convey their demands to Rimuru. Still, he and his companions would have to wait elsewhere until he called for them. However, Room said Rimuru is friendly under normal circumstances, but not at the moment because Falmouth declared war on terror, and some of Rimuru's friends died as a result. but Lord Carlos stayed defiant and shouted that Room, as a champion of Falmouth, was duty-bound to mediate for them. He was completely oblivious to Diablo's boiling rage, but Raisin noticed and tried to get the fool to shut up, but he wouldn't listen. Room stated that upon hearing what Falmouth did to Tempest, he had pleaded with Rimuru to make some deal. Still, Lord Carlos screamed that as a commoner, he had no right to speak for their kingdom's cause. Meanwhile, Diablo's rage was getting stronger, so Raisin froze the moron in ice before he made things worse for their kingdom. Then he turned to the remaining lords and told them that Yume was telling the truth. They were indeed defeated, with only the Archbishop himself and the king surviving. He added that they were only set free by Rimuru because Sir Yume spoke on their behalf. The Falmouth lords couldn't believe that monsters defeated their great army, but also realized that they had no choice but to accept defeat or risk making the Storm Dragon their enemy. With that, they accepted Rimuru's offer. With that settled, Diablo decided to fulfill his promise and set their king free. Knights surrounded him as he approached the king. Still, he just introduced himself as Diablo, the great Rimuru's loyal butler. Then, he used his healing potion on the king. The king of Falmouth quickly recovered, and Diablo gave him a message from Rimuru, stating that representatives from both nations would meet for peace talks. He further outlined 3 options for the king, which included either abdicating the throne and paying reparations to Tempest, surrendering to Tempest and becoming a vassal state, or the war continuing. Diablo then gave the king and lords of Falmouth 1 week to consider the options, adding that failure to respond within the week would be taken to mean that Falmouth intended to continue the war, and with that, he took his leave. Back at the palace, he explained to Rimuru that he chose to show them the king's cursed body to strike fear into them. Then he added that he demanded 10,000 stellar gold coins as reparations. This shocked Rimuru, who saw it as unreasonable. Still, Diablo remained unfazed and said if things went according to his plan, they'd get the gold coins. He added that aside from the gold coins, the king would also be forced to surrender and thus lose his influence within the kingdom, meaning he'd be used as a scapegoat by the nobles. However, to prevent himself from totally losing power, the king would ultimately be forced to make allies with Yume and his forces, which means he'd become allies with Tempest. Impressed by Diablo's plan, Rimuru then decided to leave the matter entirely up to him. Yuki Kagurazaka and the moderate Harlequin Alliance were discussing the death of Clayman at their headquarters. Kazalim informed the group that she could no longer feel her connection to Clayman, meaning he'd truly died. This caused Kagurazaka to remark that he underestimated the demon lords and that he should have acted with more prudence. While Laplace blamed himself for their failure since it was his idea, his statement caused Tyr to express relief that Laplace had survived the battle, especially since he'd been up against Valentine, a demon lord who could rival their president. Laplace smugly told her that he'd taken advantage of the new moon, which caused the vampire's powers to wane. He further added that he wasn't as dumb as Clayman. This got Footman pissed, but Laplace continued bashing Clayman by saying that he died because he got cocky and ignored the warnings despite being weak. At this point, Footman punched Laplace for disrespecting their dead comrade. Still, before things could escalate, Big Mummy Kazalim calmed them down. Kagurazaka then stated that it was unlike Laplace to act like the bad guy, and he'd prefer it if Laplace left that title to him. The statement caused Footman to apologize to Laplace. With their arguments finally settled, Kazalim began discussing Demon Lord Valentine's statements, which proved that Clayman died. Laplace said he wished that he could have gotten some answers out of him, but she replied that at least he was safe. However, Kazalim noted that things had turned into a mess. Kagurazaka said they'd lost everything that was entrusted to Clayman, including their bases, army, funds, and treasures. Tyr didn't understand why things were bad because, although the demon lords killed Clayman, their stronghold was still safe. Footman argued that they could still make a comeback despite the loss of their army. Once they were done talking, Kagurazaka said that he called them to discuss the situation. At the round table, Kazalim informed them that the base he entrusted to Clayman was also destroyed overnight. This shocked everyone, as she also added that Rimuru had sent only a small number of his followers. Tyr and Footman were surprised and asked her if the Magin they saw on the battlefield wasn't truly their full force, to which she said yes. Kazalim then revealed that Rimuru's real strategy was to strike their stronghold. Once she finished speaking, Kagurazaka said that it was time for them to re-examine their plans. He said that they would have to be patient in the short term if they wanted to fulfill their goal of world conquest. Kazalim agreed with his point, stating that they had gotten overconfident, and the others also agreed with him. Still, Kagurazaka suggested that they strike back at Rimuru and his people in some way, for the defeat that they suffered. Taylor asked how that would be possible since they agreed to lay low, to which he replied that he'd say something, not do something. He smiled evilly and said he planned on setting something up for Rimuru. At the Holy Empire of Lubelius, Hinata walked through the streets, admiring how peaceful the city was. She remarked that it was impressive that they left their affairs to God. Their god was the demon lord Luminous Valentine, who was the only person to beat her ass in battle. Hinata continued brooding as she walked, telling herself that the only thing she could count on in the world was her strength. She then remembered her training in the Western Holy Church and how she became captain of the Holy Knights in 2 years. But over time, she saw the church for the scam it was. This is because she discovered that the Holy Emperor of Lubelius was, in fact, a vampire named Louis, who was related to the demon Lord Roy Valentine. Thus, a vampire called himself a god so that he could rule over humans, and everyone bought the lie. Before this, Hinata had confronted the false god, Louis, and his brother in an attempt to stop their ruse, and she somehow managed to beat them. However, she was badly hurt in the process. As Hinata lay on the floor bleeding to death, a young woman walked into the room and said that she wouldn't allow the vampire brothers to die and leave her behind. She then revived them both, much to Hinata's disappointment. The mystery woman, who was named Lady Luminous, then turned to Hinata and told her not to die an arrogant fool, especially because an insignificant thing like her had no right to judge whether her actions were evil or not. Lady Luminous further added that no justice would satisfy everyone, and for Hinata to think that she could enforce her ideals was sheer arrogance. At that point, she healed Hinata, who sat there gaping like a fish out of water. She gave her 1 week to overcome the trial of the 7 luminaries, after which she'd face Hinata in an earnest battle. Hinata foolishly agreed to her terms, thinking she was some hotshot. She completed the trial and then returned to challenge Lady Luminous, but unsurprisingly, she lost. As a result, Hinata surrendered to her and became her servant. Back in the present day, Hinata was still lost in thought, and she remarked to herself that unlike Dracula, Lady Luminous and the other vampires don't necessarily kill humans to live. However, unlike the Twilight vampires, they still take a little blood from humans and feed on the life energy in it. But more interestingly, the high-ranking ones could even survive for eternity without tasting human blood. Hinata also added as she continued walking that the happier a human is, the more delicious their blood tastes to the vampires. However, Lady Luminous forbade the vampires from taking large amounts of life energy. Thus, due to the lady's rule, order and fairness persisted in the Holy Empire of Lubelius to a higher degree than in the rest of the Western nations. As a result, Hinata no longer wishes to kill Lady Luminous, but instead wants to protect her. She soon arrived at a temple, where she met an edgelord-looking Louis, who informed her that his brother was dead. Hinata stared at him in disbelief and asked if Roy attended Walpurgis as a demon lord or not. Still, Louis assured her that Roy was indeed dead after getting attacked by an intruder who snuck up on him upon his return from Walpurgis. Hinata recalled her fight with a clown the previous night, and noted to herself that if he could kill Roy, then he had to be stronger than a demon lord. Nevertheless, she told Louis that as long as Lady Luminous was safe, they had no problem. But Louis disagreed by stating that Roy was meant to shake the demon lords up as a threat, and he died, which could cause their followers to lose faith. Louis further added that although the storm dragon Veldora had returned, he heard that the forest Jura remained stable. Hinata confirmed this, but she clarified that it remained stable because of the slime called Rimuru, which she let escape. Louis then informed her that the kingdom of Falmouth's army was destroyed, which meant that Rimuru was a formidable opponent. Hinata glowered and said that her best chance of ending him was when she caught him in the holy field. So Louis asked if she went easy on him because they came from the same place. Hinata said no, and added that Lady Luminous's plans do not align with the slime. Hinata and Louis soon begin to argue over humanity's response to the stability in the Jura forest. Later in the day, Hinata and Louis inform Lady Luminous about Roy's death and ask her about the events of Walpurgis. She explained what happened to them and complained that if Roy had stayed within her sight, she could have revived him. Although Hinata tried to claim responsibility for letting the intruder escape, Lady Luminous disagreed with her, stating that Hinata was following orders and that she was the one who ought to assume responsibility. Likewise, Louis decided to speak ill of the dead and stated that it wasn't her fault but Roy's, since he failed to perform his duties properly. Still, Lady Luminous moved the conversation towards their new threat, the return of the evil dragon and the appointment of Rimuru as a demon lord. She urged the two morons to come up with ideas on how to deal with the situation. Hinata, a pathetic human, offered to kill Veldora, the sky dragon. This suggestion was immediately trashed by Lady Luminous, who informed her that she stood no chance against Veldora. Still, Hinata tried arguing senselessly, but Lady Luminous informed her that Veldora was the incarnation of natural energy, and because of his will, neither swords nor spells affected him. She added that if he goes on a rampage, the shockwaves will overrun the entire world. Despite Lady Luminous's warnings, Hinata still thought to herself that she'd slay Veldora if necessary. Sensing Hinata's stupidity, Lady Luminous told her to restrain herself. Hinata remained confused about whether she could trust the information given to her by the merchant, or if she should have listened to Rimuru rather than insisting that he was a monster. Lady Luminous then said they had no choice but to leave Rimuru alone. Still, Hinata argued that the city and roads Rimuru was building could hasten the angel's advance. Still, Lady Luminous told her that it'd be worse to make Rimuru and Storm Dragon Veldora their enemies. She added that if they draw attention to themselves, then the flying creatures would target them instead. So there was no point thinking about it at the moment. Stubbornly, Hinata continued arguing that the teachings of Luminism, which say that monsters are humanity's common enemy, would be completely overturned by their city. So Lois suggested that they make Rimuru their accomplice as an evil demon lord. Lady Luminous, however, said that this was impossible, because Rimuru wanted to build a nation where he could enjoy his life. So he's willing to protect the humans because he needs their cooperation, and anyone who interferes will be his enemy. Lady Luminous added that if not for Rimuru's relationship with humans, they would have used Louis's idea. Still, they could only keep an eye on things. She instructed them to convey only the truth to their followers, which was that the Storm Dragon Veldora had returned. As for Rimuru, they'd attempt to make political negotiations with his nation. Lady Luminous then turned to Hinata and asked if it suited her, and she said yes. Knowing how problematic Hinata was, Lady Luminous asked her if it'd be a lingering grudge for her, and Hinata said there'd be a little, seeing as she did try to kill Rimuru. Lady Luminous assured her that Rimuru wasn't foolish enough to make an enemy of her. With that, Hinata said she'd handle things as best as she could. Meanwhile, in the kingdom of Falmouth, the council agreed to accept Tempest's terms and pay reparations for the war. The king stated that the reparations were to be 10,000 stellar gold coins. This news caused the loser lords to throw tantrums. Then, they became drooling like puppies over the thought of Hinata and the Western Holy Church coming to their rescue. As the lords argued, the king's brother, Edward, asked his brother if a proud king like himself would admit defeat so easily. The king informed him that they were up against Veldora, the dragon, and his pride meant nothing in the face of that tyrant. Edward tried to continue the argument, but the king just said that he'd pay the reparations and abdicate the throne. He pointed out that their only other options if he didn't surrender were to resume the war or become a vassal state, both of which would destroy their nation. Edward tried insisting that they at least resist. Still, he was cut short by another lord, who informed them that he had received a letter of great importance earlier in the day. He said the letter was about the Kingdom of Bluemund's recent declaration, in which they said that they would support Tempest and condemn Falmouth's actions. As they discussed this issue, a guard ran into the chamber and informed them that Rimuru intended to become a demon lord. As they celebrated over the possibility that the other demon lords would destroy Rimuru and Veldora for them, another guard ran in and informed them that Demon Lord Rimuru had slain Demon Lord Clayman. This development stunned them, and the guard added that Carrion renounced their Demon Lord titles and entered into the service of Demon Lord Milim. The 8 demon lords were calling themselves Octogram. While all the lords sat in shock, the king told them that Rimuru was a greater threat to them than Veldora. He admitted that their predicament was his fault for being blinded by greed, so he'd abdicate the throne and recommend Edward as his successor. The lords agreed to his proposal, and within days the Kingdom of Falmouth and the Jura Tempest Federation signed an agreement to end hostilities. This agreement meant that Falmouth recognized Tempest as a nation. In the city of Tempest, Rimuru was taking a break from the stress of leadership by relaxing on Shuna's melons. His officers Benimaru, Sue, and Rigard also gave him an update on the progress made in inspecting Clayman's castle and dividing the spoils. Rimuru asked if, as a general, Benimaru wouldn't be more used at Clayman's castle than at Tempest. Benimaru replied that since the war was over, it wouldn't do them any good to keep sticking their noses into civil matters. He added that he'd handed his authority over to his sexy aide and returned home. Rimuru thought to himself about how alike Benimaru and Shuna were when it came to running away from their responsibilities. However, his magical AI assistant, Raphael, called him out for also being a slacker, a trait that he taught his subordinates. Later on, Rimuru and his team began discussing their plans for managing the aftermath of the war. Benimaru informed them that the Beast-Katirs, along with Gabaru, would be arriving soon. Although this development surprised Rimuru, Benimaru explained that Lady Milim had destroyed the capital of Eurasia during the battle. So the refugees and prisoners would have to live in Tempest. He added that they had allocated different locations for them. Those who had villages to return to were sent back to them, and the lycanthropes who wished to learn their technology would stay in Tempest. Rimuru then informed them that he had suggested to Milim the idea of building a new capital for people to relocate to, and she loved it. Benimaru added that aside from the lycanthropes, Majin prisoners would also be brought to Tempest. Still, he would ensure that they were carefully guarded. Ever eager to lick Rimuru's ass, Rigurd interjected and said that he'd explain the situation to everyone. The fact that they were all making their own decisions and acting on them without him having to micromanage them got Rimuru excited, and he told Rigurd to go ahead. However, he suddenly got the realization that they would be fine without him, and that made him sad. The next day at the palace, Diablo briefed Rimuru on the progress of their negotiations with Falmouth. He presented the document, which served as a testament to their peace treaty and the 1,500 stellar gold coins paid towards the reparations. Rimuru remarked that the coins were more than he expected, but then Falmouth was a major nation, so it isn't surprising. Diablo, however, informed him that the majority of the coins were gotten from King Edmaris's savings. He further added that since no knights were currently protecting the royal family, King Edmaris guessed that stirring up trouble with the nobles would cause them to steal everything from him, a conclusion that Rimuru understood, and he asked Diablo if a war would break out in Falmouth as he had planned. Diablo responded that war would certainly break out since the nobles forced King Edmaris to take the unpaid reparations in the form of a loan, which the new king would be unable to endure for long. This is why King Edmaris had his brother Edward succeed him instead of his son Edgar. Upon hearing this, Rimuru's magical AI assistant, Raphael, informed him that the powers in Falmouth, who do not wish to approve the remaining reparations, would likely attempt to shift the burden onto Edmaris. This is because, since his abdication, Edmaris has become a viscount and moved to a small domain close to that of Count Needle-Migam, where the Yume's party's headquarters are based. Therefore, if anything happened, they could quickly come to his aid. At this point, Rimuru understood that if the new king tried to abandon Edmaris, Yume wouldn't let him, and Diablo added that if he called out the new king for his dishonesty, then it would lead to a revolt. Thus, he was guiding the kingdom into a natural conflict by having Yume look out for Edmaris. Rimuru praised Diablo for his perfect plan, but cautioned him to ensure that ordinary citizens suffered as little as possible. He then gave him the stellar gold coins to use if he ran out of funding for the plan. Diablo thanked him for his consideration but assured him that it wouldn't be necessary. He, however, asked for Rimuru's permission to fight. Rimuru denied this request and offered to arrange a combat force for him. He further insisted that Diablo stay out of sight, which Diablo agreed to do. Rimuru then commented that Shoin should learn a thing or two from Diablo, and she immediately started losing her *T. She started explaining to Rimuru that she'd done everything that he wanted. While Diablo said the Western Holy Church had devised a plan to make contact with Rahim, the cowardly, obese archbishop in Falmouth, the church wanted to know about Tempest's battle with the kingdom of Falmouth, so they summoned him. Rimuru noted that if they do nothing, then things could get messy for them, which Diablo agreed with. So Diablo suggested that they allow the archbishop to explain things. Rimuru noted that the Western Holy Church seemed to have been monitoring Veldora, so they probably knew that they had lied to them. Diablo asked if they should tell them the truth this time, but Rimuru suggested that they put a message in a magical ball that they would have Rahim hold and watch Church's reaction. Diablo said he understood. At that point, Gobta ran into the office and informed Rimuru that the refugees and prisoners had arrived in Tempest. Rimuru headed out in slime mode while being carried by Shoin to watch the procession of lycanthropes and Majin prisoners arrive. They were met by Albus and Sophia, who thanked Rimuru for providing their people with refuge. Rimuru welcomed them and asked if Phobia would also be coming. Still, they informed him that Phobia was busy preventing the Majin, who was back home, from rebelling. Rimuru told them that the inspection of the temporary housing was complete and they were still deciding on how to distribute jobs amongst the refugees and that he'd give them more details later. They then took their leave. Gabiru arrived not long after, and Rimuru thanked him for his efforts during the war. Although Gabiru tried to downplay his efforts by saying Midray beat him like a little child, Rimuru told him that it's not that he's weak. Eventually, he'd be as strong as Midray. Gabiru pledged to meet his expectations and presented a letter, which Lady Milim instructed him to deliver to Rimuru. The letter said Milim would be bringing along some people who wanted to look after her on her next visit to Tempest. She added that she wanted to teach them what cooking is all about, so she wanted Rimuru to please take care of it. After reading the letter, Rimuru asked Gabiru if he knew what was going on. He said that Hermes, one of the dragon faithful, informed him that, due to their traditions, the food they serve to Lady Milim is not cooked or prepared in any way. So Rimuru explained to Gabiru that since his sense of smell is similar to a human's when he eats something tasty, he'll want more things like that. This explanation helps Gabiru's small brain finally understand what Hermes was talking about. Still, Shion asked why Lady Milim couldn't just order them to cook, but Rimuru just said she's more sympathetic than she seems. Then he concluded their conversation by saying that if that is what Milim wants, then they would show them their finest hospitality. With that, Gabiru took his leave. The next day, Gobta and Rimuru. I watched the townsfolk and remarked on how both the citizens and refugees seemed more relaxed. As they were speaking, Gobta slighted Geld's coming out of a portal and drew Rimuru's attention to it. Geld looked beaten up, and so Rimuru took him to a secluded area. Once there, he asked what happened to him, but Geld first licked his ass by praising his greatness. He then told Rimuru that he organized the survivors and prisoners. Then I tasked them with surveying and clearing the land, but different problems sprang up. He mentioned that it was easy for high orcs to communicate through thought communication, but that didn't work for lycanthropes and magin. Adding to that, some among the magin were not happy with following orders, and even those who wanted to work were as productive as baby rabbits. Rimuru said he understood his problem from his days as a working man. Especially because it wasn't easy trying to train and educate people, he suggested that they have some alcohol. Later in the day, while at a bar with some hot chicks, Geld told them about his problems in the hopes of getting to feel some sympathy. He expressed his feelings of uselessness, but Rimuru comforted him, and they drank all night. The next day, while on a walk with Shion, Rigurd approached Rimuru and informed him that the merchants had begun to return since he assured them that Fuz was safe. This news excited Rimuru, but Rigurd added that no other nation had taken any bold steps since he became a demon lord. Rimuru responded that he was certain that they were still on their guard. Rigurd then told him that the empress of the sorceress dynasty of Thalion, Empress Elru Thalion, had declared that she wanted to establish diplomatic relations with Tempest. This caused Rimuru to express a desire for them to finish work on the road that would connect Tempest to various other nations. He then called a meeting to discuss the project. Benimaru informed the team that there were no hostile monsters on the route they were planning to build the road on. He added that those in the area had all consented to the road construction. Thus, Rimuru orders that they finish up surveying and other inspections until Gled is free. But Sue interjected and told Rimuru that there was one problem, which was that although the Great Forest of Jura was under his jurisdiction, it borders the Kusha Mountains, which house the Tengu. He further added that the Tengu were mild-mannered, but by their nature they were also warlike people, so it would be best to reach out to them before construction on the road began. However, before Rimuru could respond, Benimaru interjected and said he'd go, because having a demon lord approach them would be even more suspicious. Rimuru agreed to his suggestion and said he could do it, whereas his sister, Shuna, pointed out that he might just be trying to see his hot crush, Albus. This news shocked Rimuru, but Benimaru quickly denied it. Shion assured Rimuru that even with Benimaru gone, he'd still have her. Benimaru asked what she meant, and she said he'd become a simp for Albus and leave Tempest to be with her. However, Rimuru said he'd never do that. This caused Benimaru to tell the others that Great Rimuru had faith in him. At the same time, Rimuru said they should stop talking about the matter. Later in the day, Rimuru sat alone at their meeting place and said to himself that there were still so many problems to solve. Then he decided to call everyone together for a meeting the next day. The next day, Rimuru summoned Hakuro to his palace office for a discussion, and they briefly spoke about how hard things were for Geld. Then Hakuro said he had news to tell Rimuru regarding the puppet nation of Distav, which was under Clayman's rule. He said the citizens consisted of the Dark Elves who maintained the castle, and they had all sworn their loyalty to Clayman. Then, it was added that there used to be a Dark Elves kingdom in Distav, where ruins could still be found, and they called themselves Gravekeepers. Rimuru said he understood, and that Clayman's wealth must have been derived from selling those artifacts. Hakuro then said that most of the ruins remain undiscovered. Still, Rimuru told him to keep that information a secret because he wanted to see the place before making a decision. Later on, Rimuru called a general meeting and informed them that he was now a demon lord. He further informed them that it had been decided that his domain would be the entire Great Forest of Jura, but everyone kept quiet. He asked if there was a problem, and they asked if his territory included the area across the river, to which he said yes. Benimaru said that although there wasn't a big issue, the area across the river wasn't under the Dryads' influence, and only the part created by the Dryads recognized Rimuru as its leader. He added that for those across the river, His emergence as a demon lord would be troubling, because people are used to indiscriminately using the resources located there, so the fact that they'd now have to seek permission from Rimuru would be a problem. Thus, Rimuru realized that he'd soon be flooded with guests seeking his permission, and his friends told him it was just a perk of being a demon lord. Nobody is dumb enough to consider a demon lord an enemy. Still, Rimuru insisted that those things didn't matter to him. Gabiru then informed him that the lizard men were coming to pay their respects, and he had told Shion about it because his father wanted to greet him in person. At this point, Rimuru thought to himself that if the lizard men were traveling so far to see him, then people from even smaller races would also be coming, which meant he might as well put out an announcement inviting everyone at once so that they'd introduce their city. He further added that it would be an opportunity to boost their population and relieve stress after such a tense period. Rimuru then simplified his words by saying they should throw a party, and everyone excitedly agreed. What creatures do you think will show up for Rimuru's party? Comment Big Melon Shion if you want part 2. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.